All right, so we leave the skin behind and we go down one step deeper. Actually, kind of go multiple steps deeper, all the way to the center, so to speak, and talk about bones. And the bone chapters are really sort of, there's three of them. There's this osseous tissue, chapter 6, is all about bone tissue, but not about specific bones or specific bones working together. The next chapter, chapter 7, is where we talk about the skeleton, in other words, specific bones. And most of that information we're really going to get in lab, because it's easier to learn the bones when you can hold them and look at them. And then chapter 8 is articulations, and that's where bones come together. And that will sort of get us ready to talk about muscles. If once you have bones that can move in relation to one another, we need a way to move those, so we'll get into muscle. In terms of the tests, this chapter 6 is part of unit 1, not because it fits very well, but because it makes the tests or the exams a little more evenly distributed across the course. So this information will be in the unit 1 exam, but then the skeleton, articulations, and muscle stuff will all be together. All right. So we divide up the skeleton into two regions, the appendicular and the axial. So the axial skeleton, this comes from axis. Axis is the center of the thing, right? So the axial skeleton is the center of the body. So we're talking about the skull, the ribs, the vertebrae, and then the sacrum at the back. So we'll talk, when we get to talking about the skeleton, we're going to talk about that first. And then the appendicular skeleton, this comes from appendages, as in arms and legs. So the appendicular skeleton are the arms and legs and the bones that attach them to the axial skeleton. And just like we did with the skeletal system, the skeletal system has multiple functions. The one that's easiest to think about is support. The bones hold us up. If it wasn't for the bones, we'd be big piles of mush on the and muscle, that wouldn't be able to do very much. So that's its primary role, is to hold the body up, to support the other organs, and to support us as we move through the world. But also, the skeleton is a storage place for certain key minerals, namely calcium. We're going to see when we get to the muscle chapter and the nervous chapter that calcium is a critical ion for important things happening. Every time the heart beats, every time a muscle moves, every time a nerve fires, calcium is a part of that process. So the body wants to make sure that it has plenty of calcium around all the time, because calcium is critical. And the bones accomplish that. Because bones are made up of mostly calcium, at least in terms of the mineral content there, it means that we're always carrying around a huge supply of calcium for when we need it. So, 2 to 5 pounds of the human body weight is calcium that's found in bones. So, calcium storage. And we'll see at the end of this chapter that storage can be added to or removed from. In other words, if we're not getting enough calcium in our diet, the body can pull calcium out of the bones. If we're getting adequate calcium in our diet, the body will add calcium back to the bones. So, we can spend that surplus or we can build it back up, as we'll see when we start talking about calcium homeostasis later. Okay. Inside the bones, particularly the big ones, so the femur and the pelvic crest here, is where blood cells are made, all of them. Red cells, white cells, platelets, all of the blood cells begin their lives in the bone marrow. And the marrow is the inside part of the bone. You'll see that more when you get to next semester and you actually talk about the blood. But it is a function of the skeletal system is to produce blood cells. Protection. Some of the bones, particularly the skull and the rib cage and the pelvic crests here, evolved to protect what's underneath them. Inside the thorax here are the very delicate lungs and the very important heart. So by having a sort of bony shield all around those delicate organs, the skeleton provides for protection. And then down in here, you have your digestive tract. You also have the kidneys sit right here and here. So these bones protect those delicate structures. And then the cranium, which are the bones that make up the brain case, so to speak, protect the very delicate and important brain. So the skeleton provides protection. And then leverage. This is a concept that's a little harder to understand, but if you've ever used a crowbar, that's the concept of leverage. In other words, if you take a long piece of something and apply force to one side, you can multiply that force because of the length of that lever or that piece. And the muscles and bones work together like this. The reason that we can throw a ball fairly quickly is because of leverage. The muscles pull on that bone just a little at the proximal end, but it creates a large motion at the distal end. So when we get to articulations, we're going to talk a little bit more about leverage, but that's another function of the skeletal system, is to amplify what we can do with our bodies through leverage. All right. So we classify bones in a number of different ways. The first one that your book presents is by shape. So there are flat bones, which not surprisingly are flat. And what I mean by that is they have two surfaces that are roughly parallel to one another. So they're kind of like a hard sandwich. And you'll see these predominantly in the skull. These are protection bones. They surround the brain and provide for its protection. Sutural bones are the rarest kind. They're found only in the skull, and they're basically little islands of bones where the other flat bones have come together. Not a particularly important classification. Long bones, though, these are the bones we talk most about. And these are the bones you probably think of when you think bone. So like your thigh bone and your calf bone, your forearm bone, your upper arm bone, those are all long bones. And long bones have two knobby ends and a thin shaft in between them. So like the typical, dog bone picture, that's a long bone because it has two knobby ends and then a long part in the middle. And we're going to talk more about the long bone anatomy in a second. The irregular bones, these are bones that have very complex shapes. And typically, they get their shapes based on their function. So like the vertebra stack together to make the spinal column, and they have to be able to move and twist and bend in a variety of different ways. So they have all these things sticking out from them because it's different things attached to these different processes. Another example of a bone like this is the scapula or the shoulder blade, where its shape is very complex, but every little part of that shape has a purpose or a reason why it's like that. Sesamoid bones are bones that form after birth, and usually they form inside of tendons. So your patella, or your kneecap, is the largest of the sesamoid bones, and believe it or not, you're not born with a kneecap. You're not born with a bony patella. That patella develops over time, particularly as we start walking. The forces that are going across the knee actually trigger the development of that patella. So when you examine a newborn, you can feel their knees and they won't have that kneecap like you're used to. And then short bones. Short bones are kind of small and boxy. And predominantly we see these in the wrists and the ankle. And the reason they're there is short bones can kind of slide against each other very easily. So it gives our wrists and our ankles a lot of motion and still a lot of strength. So when we get to those particular joints in the articulation chapter, we'll talk more about short bones. But typically, we're going to talk about long bones most. All right. Bones have features. So if you look at a bone, you'll see that there'll be rough spots, there'll be parts that stick out, there'll be little holes that go down into the bone. So these different surface features of the bone have different names. And because some of these are going to be required learning, particularly in lab, I thought I would just go through some of the terms that we use to describe surface features. So a canal or a meatus is a passageway. So just like a canal of water allows passage from one place to another, a canal is a passageway for something to pass through a bone. And meatus is just another term like that. So like the auditory meatus is the ear hole of the skull. So it's a passageway down into the inner ear. A sinus is an area inside a bone that is hollow. So to reduce the weight of the skull, evolution created hollow spaces in the skull, and we call those hollow spaces sinuses. Normally they're filled with air, but as any of us who have had a bad sinus infection can tell you, they can also be filled with fluid too. Now that's not the normal case, but a foramen is a small rounded hole. So a foramen is a hole. A fissure is a kind of long and narrow gap. So in some ways, like a fissure is a crack. So a fissure is usually a gap that is longer than it is wide. A process is any part of the bone that sticks out. So, for example, if you tap behind your ear, there is a part of the skull that kind of sticks out back there. That's called the mastoid process, and it's called a process because it sticks out from the skull. Okay. Some other surface features. Long bones have heads, so there'll be a head at one end. A tubercle is a small rounded projection. Like the, we'll get to that later. A sulcus is a deep, narrow groove, so it's kind of a valley in a bone. A tuberosity is a rough projection, a small rough projection. And then, we'll talk about that later too. Okay. Sorry. I'm trying to keep it simple for now, and then we'll get into the specifics when we get to the actual bones. A trochanter is a large rough projection, so you can compare that to a tuberosity. So a tuberosity is like a small trochanter. A trochanter is a large rough projection. A tuberosity is a small one. A neck is a narrow spot on a bone. Oftentimes the neck is associated with the head. So if this is the head, then the more distal part there is the neck. A facet is a flat spot. So we see facets where oftentimes where two bones come together and they have to rub against each other very smoothly. A crest is a prominent ridge. A fossa, this is a good one to know, is kind of a shallow indentation. If you would think of like a cereal bowl that was not very deep, that would be a fossa. So we have kind of an indentation. A spine is a pointy part. And then a ramus is a part that makes an angle. So like here in the pelvis, come back here, this would be the ramus right here because it makes an angle. So, and we're going to go through all these when we talk about the actual bones later, but just a little introduction to some of those words so they're not entirely new when you see them in other places like foramen and canal. All right, so long bones, because they share a lot of anatomy. In other words, all the different long bones of the body share some things in common. We give the anatomy here some particular names. So in a long bone, we have three parts. We have a diaphysis. The diaphysis is the long shaft part in the middle, so it's tubular. We have an epiphysis at each side. So the knobby part of the bones, we have an epiphysis proximally and an epiphysis distally. So this is the epiphysis, this is the epiphysis. Between the epiphysis and the diaphysis is the metaphysis. Now I know these words sound funny and strange, but clinically relevant because when you go to start talking about fractures, the very first question that somebody's going to ask you is, well, where in the bone is the fracture? And, like metaphyseal fractures are the most serious, particularly in kids. But it's the diaphysis that gets broken most often because it's the thinnest part. And then the epiphysis, because this is where the bones connect to other bones, can be the most difficult to manage of, fractures. So you got three new vocabulary words today on this part at least. The epiphysis, the metaphysis, and the diaphysis. All right. Bones evolved to transfer force. You know, this is our femur, right? So this is your thigh bone. And all of the weight of the body is sitting on the head, right? You know, which is holding you up off the ground. So your body weight has to be transferred all the way through this bone and down to the next bone if you're going to stand up straight. So bones evolved to transmit these forces from above to below, or you know, from side to side. So what we can see here is in the epiphysis here and here, we have this. This is called spongy bone, or bone that has kind of a three-dimensional shape to it. And then in the diaphysis, we see that it's hollow, right? And the walls of the diaphysis don't have these little holes in it. So this is compact bone, as we'll talk about. And essentially, the spongy bone and the compact bone together work to transmit that force. So the force comes in and it's kind of shifted laterally. Then it goes all the way down the length of the bone through the diaphysis. And then it spreads back out again as that bone then connects to the tibia at the knee. So, and we'll see some other examples of how this spongy bone and compact bone sort of work together to transmit forces. All right. What I think is one of the most common misconceptions about bone is that they're dry and dead, you know, hard, dry, and dead. Because in lab, you know, that's what we see. Or, you know, when you see a bone, you know, that's what you see is it's hard, dead thing. But the reality is, in the living human being, bones are very much alive. They're active, busy metabolic places. They're very vascular. So, like, if you look at this long bone here, you see arteries and veins, you know, everywhere in this bone. And that's the way bone is. It's highly vascular. So, like, when there is a fracture, one of the most important aspects of that is the bleeding that occurs. Because bone has such a rich blood supply, when you get a fracture, you're going to get massive bleeding and what's called a hematoma around that fracture site. It's actually part of how bones heal, which we'll talk more about when we get to the end of this chapter. And then in addition to arteries and veins, bones are very richly innervated too. They have a ton of nerve endings that go there. Anybody broken a bone in here? Did it hurt? It hurts usually a lot. And it's because bone has a lot of nervous tissue, particularly in the edges. Like this membrane that covers the bone is very richly innervated and it really hurts a lot. Bone pain is one of the hardest kinds of pain to control in terms of medication as well. All right, so let's do a question. What do we call the end of a long bone? And that. Just a second. There we go. Now it should be out to you. Which it's an easy question right now because we just talked about it, right? But you'll have to remember epiphysis, diaphysis, and metaphysis, and don't get them confused, okay? So the epiphysis is the ends, the diaphysis is the shaft, and the metaphysis is the part in the middle. Now, why do we name the part in the middle? Because it's at the metaphysis that bones grow. And when we talk about how bones grow here, probably next time, you'll see why it gets its own name. Because the growth plate that allows long bones to get longer as we get taller and larger, that happens at the metaphysis. All right. So which of these is correctly matched in terms of classification by shape? Bless you. Not as much certainty about this one. All right, 10 seconds. Jump in there if you haven't already. All right, the correct answer there is going to be A, the short bones. So the short bones are primarily found in the wrist and the ankle. So you have the carpals. Carpus is wrist, and talus is one of the words anyway for ankle. So short bone. The vertebrae is an irregular bone, not a long bone. The femur would be a long bone. Flat bones are usually found in the skull, and then the humerus is a long bone. All right. All right, so bone is a connective tissue. Now, we learned last time or in the last chapter, not the last chapter, but chapter 4, that a connective tissue has a lot more stuff than cells. Unlike an epithelial tissue where most of the tissue's mass is made up of cells, in a connective tissue it's the opposite. Most of the tissue's mass is made up of something else besides cells. So, and that the non-cellular component of a connective tissue we call the matrix. Okay? So in bone, that matrix is made up of fibers and crystal. So the fibers, which are collagen fibers, they provide a kind of framework for the bone. So one way to think of this is as concrete. If you're familiar at all with concrete, concrete is very hard and brittle, right? If you smash it with a hammer, it'll break. But if you take concrete and you run steel bars through it, it gives the concrete more strength. It doesn't break as easily and it becomes more flexible. Another example, which you might be more familiar with, is paper mache. If you're going to paper mache a balloon, let's say, it's the balloon that gives the shape, and it's the paper mache that then makes it hard, right? Well, the same thing is happening in the bone. The collagen fibers give the bone its shape, and then the minerals that are deposited around those fibers give the bone its hardness. And both parts are critical. Without the collagen fibers, we would have bones that would be very brittle and potentially not shaped correctly. If we just had collagen fibers and no minerals, we'd have soft, flexible, squishy bones, which are not going to hold us up. So we have these two components to the matrix of bone. Now, the mineral component, or the hard part, is this complicated crystal called hydroxyapatite. So if you see this word, hydroxyapatite, that is the mineral that is found in bone. It's made up of calcium phosphate and calcium hydroxide. And both of these are substances that form very hard materials when they come out of solution. So collagen fibers and minerals. Now, in addition to the hydroxyapatite, which is primarily calcium and phosphate, there are other minerals that end up getting stored in bone too. So calcium carbonate, magnesium, sodium, fluoride. A mineral that has a clinical connection is lead. In lead poisoning cases, particularly in children, lead is actually deposited in bone too. So one of the difficulties with treating lead poisoning is even if you stop their lead ingestion, they have lead in their bones that's going to leach out potentially for years afterwards. So bone can end up storing some nasty stuff as well as some good stuff, but these are the primary minerals in bone. All right. So the cells responsible for creating both the collagen fibers and this crystalline component are osteoblasts and osteocytes. And we're going to talk about the different cells here in just a minute, but just for now, these two cells are what create the matrix of the bone, so the collagen fibers and the minerals. So the easiest way, I think, to remember the cells that are found in bone is to look at the roots of the words and then go from there. So anytime you see the word osteo, somebody's talking about bone. So like osteoporosis, which many of you have heard. Porosis is holy or full of pores. So osteoporosis is bones that are full of holes, which is exactly what osteoporosis looks like under the microscope. Okay, so osteo is bone. Cyte is cell, like cytosis or endocytosis. This is a new one, a blast cell. Blast means to form or to create. And then clast is the opposite. Clast means to destroy. Because what we find is that we have osteocytes, osteoblasts, and osteoclasts. And each of those three cells do something different. So osteocytes, these are mature bone cells. So these are bone cells that hang out for years and years in the bone, and their job is to maintain the bone that's around them. And I'll show you a picture here in a minute that every osteocyte is surrounded by a region of bone. And that region of bone is their responsibility. That osteocyte is keeping up and maintaining that area. What's interesting about bone is that it's constantly being dissolved and remade. So there again, we often think of bones as kind of dead things, but they're not. New calcium and new collagen are being made all the time. Old calcium, old collagen are being destroyed all the time. So essentially, there is no part of your bones that is as old as you are, because the bone is always being refreshed, so to speak, which is one of the ways that bones stay so strong and flexible even into old age. Osteocytes also play a role in bone repair. Because they're sort of trapped in the bone, as I'll show you in a minute, if there's an injury in that area, the osteocyte can kind of wake up and start repairing the bone around it because it's already there. Okay. So these osteocytes, they live in little tiny spaces called lacunae. Okay, so here we got a long bone, right? This is probably from the diaphysis. We're going to zoom in here. So we're looking at just the wall, so just this part. And you can see that there are these little holes right here. Well, each of these little sort of moon-shaped or sort of shaped like this, like an eyeball. Each one of those shapes that you see is a lacuna, and inside each lacuna is an osteocyte. So there's going to be one here, and here, and here, and here, and then in here as well. So every time you see one of those lacunae, just know that you've got an osteocyte in there. Now, you might think, well, how does this osteocyte way over here, how is it going to get its oxygen and nutrients and get rid of its waste products if the blood vessels are way over here? Well, it turns out that all of the osteocytes are connected to each other by these tiny little thread-like extensions. So here's the cell body, right? And then the cell body has these sort of finger-like or root-like projections that reach out through the bone. So this is all bone here, so hard and tough. And then those extensions reach out to touch other osteocytes. So there's a path for nutrients from here all the way here through these little tiny finger-like projections. So the passageways that attach these two cells to each other with these little threads are called canaliculi. Now let's look at that word for a minute. A canal is a passage, so this is a tiny canal. A canaliculi is a tiny canal, or a canal is canal, so a tiny little canal. All right. So these osteocytes, they started out as osteoblasts, or cells that create bone. And what they end up doing is just like painting yourself into a corner, or you're mopping the floor and you end up in the corner because you don't want to walk across your own thing. The osteocytes essentially do that same thing with bone. They make bone around themselves, and then at some point they're locked in. So they make their own lacunae by creating the bone that's around it. And then once they've done that, the osteoblast becomes an osteocyte and then sits there and maintains that bone, getting its nutrients through these little canaliculi that connect the lacunae and the osteocytes that are inside them together. Okay, I think we did that. Yep, okay. All right, so osteoblasts make bone, osteocytes maintain it. The last of the cells is the osteoclasts. So these are cells, these are bone destroyers. They're actually relatives of a cell called a macrophage. And a macrophage is it sounds like a big nasty cell. Macro is big, phage is to eat. So this is a big cell that eats. And macrophages do just that. They patrol the body and they gobble up and destroy anything that doesn't belong. Well, osteoclasts are kind of a brother of the macrophage, and their job is to take bone apart. So they dissolve the crystal, so they free up the calcium and phosphate, and they also destroy the collagen fibers that the osteoblasts and osteocytes make. So you might think that was sort of a bad idea. You know, why do we have cells that make bone if we're just going to destroy that bone later? Well, it's all part of the balance of bone and calcium and phosphate need. You know, calcium and phosphorus are things we need all the time. So when our calcium level is low, osteoclasts are in the bone freeing it up, you know, dissolving bone to release calcium for other things. In addition, because the osteoclasts are taking bone apart all the time, new bone is always being replaced, or old bone is always being replaced by new bone because of the balance of the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts destroying bone and making bone. So just like I said earlier, bones are very much alive. They're not a static scaffolding. For example, you know, say you started a new exercise regimen where you are going to carry weight while you jog, let's say. One of the things that happens in that case is the increased stress on your bones from carrying that extra weight. It triggers osteoclast activity to go down and osteoblast activity to go up. So the balance shifts towards making more bone. So in a matter of a few weeks, your bones will actually get heavier and stronger because the balance changed, because now more osteoblasts are working than osteoclasts. So more calcium is added to the bone gets stronger. If it wasn't for this constant balancing act, we wouldn't be able to do stuff like that, you know, to have our bones adapt to what we actually need them to do. Because out there in nature, you know, there's no point in carrying around big, heavy bones if you're not using them for anything. You know, in other words, if you're just carrying your own body weight, why carry another 10 pounds worth of bone if you don't need it? So this system of recycling and this balance between making and destroying bone helps to keep our bones only as strong as we actually use them for. All right. And then the last type of cell that you find in bone is the osteoprogenitor cell. This is kind of the mother cell of bone. So the osteoprogenitor cells can produce new osteoblasts and new osteocytes. So say you've had a bone injury where some bone was lost. You know, you got in a car crash and your femur shattered. Well, the only way you're going to grow that bone back is to create new osteoblasts that'll become new osteocytes. And these osteoprogenitor cells, they do just that. So looking at the, so here's our bone. We're going to look at the inside edge. So this is the outside, this is the inside. We zoom into that inside edge, we see both of the other two cells. So the osteoprogenitor cell, it doesn't look like much here, but its claim to fame is it can produce new osteocytes, which can then produce new bone. And then the osteoclast, which we would also find typically on the inside surface of the bone or the lining of the marrow, you can see this is a giant cell. So remember, it's brother of a macrophage, and it has a whole bunch of nuclei. That's because osteoclasts are actually cells. They start out as multiple cells, and they all join together into this giant bone-eating blob that we call the osteoclast. So, and it's going to destroy this calcium matrix here, all the while that the osteocytes and osteoblasts are creating that matrix. All right. So just to give you an example of, you know, the two parts, you know, the mineral part and the fiber part. You can actually take a chicken bone and you can soak it in vinegar for several days. That vinegar pulls the calcium and the hydroxyapatite out of the bone, and then all that's left is the collagen fibers. And what's interesting is, you know, that looks normal. It looks like if you pick that up, it would feel like a bone. But without the hydroxyapatite, it is absolutely flexible, like rubber. So the collagen gives it its shape, and then the hydroxyapatite is what's important for giving bone its hardness, which we depend on to carry weight. Yeah?
I have a question. I don't know if the disease is called, but it's like the brittle bone disease.
Mm-hmm.
Is that
Osteogenesis imperfecta. That's what that's called, yeah.
Is that where the calcium doesn't form like it should?
It's actually more of a collagen problem than a calcium problem. Because the collagen doesn't form right, the calcium doesn't form right, the hydroxyapatite doesn't, and it makes their bones much easier to break. Yeah, but it's a collagen problem. There's multiple types of osteogenesis imperfecta, but the bone one, they're all collagen disorders. So it's actually the collagen side of it that's more of a problem than the other. All right. Okay, collagen and calcium hydroxyapatite are the principal components of what? A lot of softball questions in these here lately. Too easy. You got to find some harder questions.
That's the second question for a second right now. Like, this is important. Interjections.
All right, 10 seconds. Jump in there. I got 7 people. Oh, there we go. Now
My phone's kind of
going squirrely on you.
yeah.
3, 2, 1. All right, so the correct answer there is A, bone matrix. And once again, the easy question now because we've just been talking about it. But when you hear hydroxyapatite, think bone. There's nowhere else in the body that has that substance in it. And hydroxyapatite is a complex crystal. Mostly it's calcium and phosphorus. Because what you'll see, not so much in this course, but when you start learning about hormone diseases, endocrine diseases, calcium and phosphorus are inversely proportional. So when one goes up, the other goes down. So it's important to remember that hydroxyapatite has both calcium and phosphorus in it. Okay. Which of the following cell types is responsible for breaking down bone? And while we're waiting on these last few people, don't forget you got homework due tonight, so chapter 5, don't forget to do that. What was it? Oh, and I apologize for the late start and me not letting you know that before, so I appreciate your patience today. All right, so the correct answer here is B, osteoclast. Clast is destroyer. Chondro is cartilage, so we're going to hear chondrocytes and chondroblasts later, but that's cartilage. Fibro is fibers. I think a fibroblast creates fibers. All right, thank you, everybody. I'll see you on Friday.